Hi, and welcome to the X22 Report Spotlight. Today we have a returning guest, James Wesley Rawles. James' expertise is primarily in retreat security, food storage, firearms, communications, first aid, and off-grid power systems. James is a former U.S. Army intelligence officer and is the owner and creator of survivalblog.com. And I am very happy to have him back on the X22 Report Spotlight. James, welcome back to the Spotlight.
Thanks for having me on.
Hey, thanks for being back here. And I wanted to start off with an update on the economy. I mean, in the news, we've been seeing, stores closing left and right, a lot of them going bankrupt. A lot of stores that we've seen for a very long time no longer exist. We also have the debt ceiling, the budget coming up the end of September, and we have many other things happening in the economy. And I wanted to get your take on how you feel the economy is doing and what direction we're heading in.
Sure. Well, I think we're still in the opening stages of a multi-decade-long global depression. And I think it all started back in the year 2000. And what we've seen is just basically the desperate measures that the central banks have been taking by ridiculously reducing interest rates to try to reinflate an economy that's basically on its last legs. They've tried to, by injections of cheap money, keep things afloat. And what we're seeing underneath all that is the real economy is continuing to crumble because of the debt burden alone is enough to stifle an economy. And the debt burden now is just reached absurd proportions. There's now $1.5 trillion just in student loan debt out there, not to mention just the mountains and mountains of automobile loans, home loans, businesses that are in hock. And of course, the government itself is in debt unsustainably, where their only way out of the debt eventually is going to be to massively inflate the currency. But they're not willing to do that quite yet because they know that if they inflate their way out of the problem, they're also going to crash the economy. So that's where we stand right now, in my estimation.
Now, what's very interesting is that Mark Zuckerberg, he was giving a speech to, I guess, the Harvard graduates, and he started mentioning universal basic income. And I thought it was a very strange thing to mention, while these, college graduates are coming out of school, they want to look for jobs. And he's talking about everyone receiving money from the government, which is actually the central bank. But I mean, what's your take on why he decided to start mentioning that?
I think he was having one of those Marie Antoinette, let them eat cake moments where he's really not in touch with reality. And it's really easy as a multi-billionaire to blithely say, oh, well, everyone should have a basic income every year. He's just lost touch with reality. And to think that we could create that money out of thin air indefinitely just shows you, how out of touch he really is. He's living in a fantasy world. In fact, he kind of created a fantasy world with social media, and it's caused him to basically lose touch with reality and basic sound economic principles. You just can't do that and have a society survive. It's not going to happen.
I mean, if they started to actually do this, let's go on the premise that they would actually start, giving funds to individuals. Do you think this would help the economy, or do you think that this would make the economy even worse?
Oh, in the short term, it'll probably do great things for the economy. But in the long term, it's going to absolutely destroy the economy, destroy the U.S. dollar as a currency unit, and destroy the full faith and credit of the United States. We just can't embark on that. We already have mountains and mountains of debt, and to make it even worse would just be absolute suicide. Even as it is, it's almost mathematically impossible to repay the national debt. It's just, if you look at the way that money is created in our system, it's mathematically impossible to begin with. So to add even more to that, I think would be absolutely suicidal for our society and for our government. And anyone who suggests something like that really ought to have their head examined.
Do you think this is like the last act of the central bank, the government, where they have no other alternatives right now because, I mean, if we really look at unemployment and we look at what's happening in retail and the rest of the economy, everything is contracting right now and they have nothing left. I mean, they created all this currency with stimulus. Do you think this is their last act?
Yeah, it's sort of, because at this point, they've run out of arrows in their quiver. And more importantly, they've backed themselves into a corner on interest rates because they can't lower rates at this point. And if they raise them by more than just 0.25%, very gradually, over the course of years or even decades, they're going to stall the economy and crash the system. So they basically are out of weapons in their arsenal. And unless they come up with something really creative, my personal favorite, my prediction is that it's going to go the debt crisis will go multinational. And instead of our own central bank doing more quantitative easing, they will do quantitative easing for another country, say Canada or England. And then they, in turn, will do quantitative easing for us. So basically, we'll be buying each other's garbage paper. I think that will probably be their last ditch effort to try to keep the economy rolling along. But as we mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, the real economy is crumbling. Traditional retail is just about dead in this country. Shopping malls look like mausoleums at this point. You go into these malls and there's nobody buying anything. There's people there walking the circuit because they want to be indoors where it's air conditioned in the summer and heated in the winter. They're doing their exercise in these malls. Other than that, there's not a lot of real shoppers in these malls at all. The real economy is dead. And we have more people on different forms of public assistance than ever before in this nation. The real rate of unemployment in this country is somewhere north of 20%, and no one's willing to admit it.
So you're saying that, I mean, I've talked about it on my reports, but you're saying that the unemployment numbers, they just possibly could not be real.
Yeah, they're not real at all. The government fudges the numbers because they remove anyone who's chronically unemployed from the unemployment statistics. So someone who's not actively looking for work doesn't count as someone who's out of work. So the real unemployment rate, again, is somewhere in excess of 20%. And if you just look around, especially in small towns or in inner cities and urban areas, you see the same thing across the country, whether you're in small town Missouri or whether you're in downtown Los Angeles, you see the same thing, which is a lot of people out of work. And basically, they've given up. So we really have a hidden depression going on right now because there's no longer public assistance in the form of food stamps. Everyone is given these magical EBT cards that look just like a credit card. And when you're in the checkout line at your local grocery store, the person ahead of you may look like they're using a credit card to pay for their groceries. Odds are they're not. Odds are they're using an EBT card. And if it weren't for that, there'd be people who are in very desperate mode right now in this country. We really are in a depression. No one's willing to admit it. It's like this enormous fantasy that the Federal Reserve, the U.S. Treasury, and the mass media are all perpetuating. They're perpetuating this fantasy of the so-called recovery, which never happened. We have the semblance of a recovery, but only because billions, if not trillions of dollars were created out of thin air. Those dollars can never be repaid, and they're not really adding to the real infrastructure of the bedrock economy of this nation. They're just putting window dressing on a shop that's out of business.
You mentioned the food stamps and things like that, and we mentioned universal basic income. And when I look at this, and if we look back, back into the 30s when there was the Great Depression, we saw like the soup lines, the bread lines, people leaving their area to try to find work. It to me, I call it hush money, where they'll give individuals food stamps, they'll give individuals funding so they stay silent, so we don't see what's really happening in the real economy.
There are invisible bread lines in every city in America right now, but they're invisible because they've been fully automated. And because it's in the form of WIC payments and EBT cards and general assistance and all these things, and a lot of it's direct. People don't even have to go cash checks at their bank. They're directly deposited into their accounts. And if it weren't for that whole segment of the economy, plus all the people who are retired, who are drawing Social Security, which is being financed in part by the younger generation, but in part by additional debt. And if it weren't for the people who are on pensions, we really wouldn't have much of a functioning economy right now. And most people have completely ignored this. The mass media is oblivious to it. You have the cheering section on CNBC talking about how great the stock market is and how people are making fortunes, when in reality, all the money that's being made is basically handing the same dollars around and just passing them around. There's no real economy in function here, in operation. Basically, the only real wealth that is created is either mined, fished, farmed, or harvested, like the trees being cut down. If it's not pulled out of the ground one way or the other, then it's not a real economic attribute. And to see the valuation of some of these high-tech companies, especially ones that really create nothing. Look at Facebook as a prime example. The market capitalization of Facebook right now is much larger than General Motors, Caterpillar Tractor, Boeing, and Lockheed combined. And what do they actually create? Nothing. Again, we're just passing the same dollars around. And you can keep up that charade for a while, but it can't go on indefinitely. At some point, we're going to see a huge credit crisis in this country, and we're going to see a full-blown economic collapse. We've just been forestalling it for 17 years.
You know, it's very interesting that you mentioned a credit crisis, because the IMF came out with a warning that China's credit growth is worrisome. And because of what the Fed is doing right now, where they're raising the interest rates, it's going to hurt some of the Asian countries. They also said that the U.S. economy is very uncertain now because of Trump's economic policies. Does that sound like a warning to you?
China is a prime example of this facade economy, just like we have in the United States, but amped up to another level. There are cities that are sitting empty because they want to keep their construction industry rolling along. And because it's a centrally planned economy with an opaque currency system, they can basically do whatever they want. And I think they're going to keep their charade up possibly just as long as they do here in the United States. But there, it's just an order of magnitude larger. It's almost frightening to see what's happened in China. And again, because they don't have the same visibility of their system that we have here in the States, they don't even publish the equivalent of the M1, M2, M3. In fact, we've even done away with one of those here in the States because it was an embarrassing truth. In China, there's no visibility at all of what's really going on with the yuan and the renminbi. And the manipulations that have gone on to keep exports of Chinese consumer goods rolling out to the United States, Japan, and Europe. I mean, they've had to go through some serious athletic events there to try to manipulate currencies, manipulate interest rates, and just in general perpetuate this system, because the Chinese model is built on continuous growth. And if that growth ever stops, it will absolutely collapse, because there's been so much malinvestment in the Chinese economy in these just outrageous projects. The Three Rivers Gorge Dam, for example, in China, cost billions. And they've built, again, entire cities that are sitting empty. They have factories that are cranking out widgets just ad nauseum with no real market for them. And it's all been built on credit. And unfortunately, because of the trade imbalance we have with China, some of that credit has actually come from the United States. We very foolishly invested in China. And when that all comes crashing down, I think it's going to be a very rude awakening for a lot of people.
Do you think that the credit problem will come out of China and then spread to the rest of the globe? Do you think that will be like the start of everything?
It could be, although because all the countries are now producing these make-believe currencies and have these grossly inflated credit markets, any of those countries could have a emperor has no clothes moment at any time. It's just a matter of when the spotlight falls on them. And that could be the first country to kick off a global credit crisis. And I think if we have another credit crisis, it's going to make the crisis of 2007, 2008 look very small by comparison. Part of it is the insane levels to which debts have been run up, and part of it due to the credit derivatives that have grown up in parallel. There are now $550 trillion notional of derivatives in play at any given time. That's about 3 times the entire world's money supply, including all tangibles like factory equipment and gold and silver. And every dollar, every won, every pound, every franc in circulation, 3 times over in derivatives. And unfortunately, what's happened with derivatives is most of those are very, very highly tuned to very small fluctuations in markets. And because that whole system of derivatives built up in fairly stable times, they did go through the 2007 crisis, 2008 crisis, but most of that has grown up since then. And like, for example, credit default swaps, CDSs, those are all predicated upon microscopic moves in interest rates. And if interest rates were to move, say, a full percentage point, it would absolutely implode the CDS market. Those over-the-counter credit default swaps would just totally implode. And the counterparty risk is enormous. Most people do not realize just what a huge risk derivatives create in a system. Inherently, derivatives are designed to reduce risk because they're a hedge. But when you have unlimited counterparty risk, those hedges actually become huge risks in the system. The threat of a derivatives implosion that would be coincidental with a credit market implosion are astronomical. They will not just bring down companies, they will bring down countries, because they'll bring down entire currencies, they'll bring down entire full credit markets, they will bring votes of no confidence in a lot of the parliamentary style governments. They will cause entire governments to go bankrupt. Essentially, they would have multiple Venezuelas in Western countries all at once, primarily on the southern tier of Europe, everywhere from Spain across to Turkey. We could see just whole governments going belly up, whole currencies no longer functioning as currency units. It could be huge, and most people have completely ignored the threat of derivatives.
So, are we seeing signs of this? Because, in Canada, we have the Home Capital Group. They are in trouble. That financial institution, people are taking their deposits out of that. We also see Banco Popular. That bank is in trouble right now. And either there's going to be a bailout, which I don't think is going to happen, or maybe a bail-in, unless they find some type of buyer. It looks like we're starting to see very similar things that we saw back in 2007, 2008.
Yeah. It very well could happen again. And again, we just haven't reached the trigger point, and we haven't had any particular banking institution, whether it's a commercial bank or whether it's or even a central bank, have its emperor has no clothes moment yet. And when that does happen, it's all going to unravel very quickly. The ripples will be felt all around the globe. And again, before it's all over, I think it'll also start a derivatives crisis. And that, in turn, will take down entire currencies and entire governments.
When you're talking about the derivative crisis and it takes down currencies, freezes up credit. For those people who don't understand how bad this would be, when the currency freezes up or the credit freezes up, what will they feel when this all occurs? I mean, will they be able to, go out and use their dollar? Will they be able to use their credit card? Will they be able to go shopping? I mean, what will happen? I mean, will they see it? Will they feel it?
Well, some of it, depending on where you're living, some of it may just be news on television. If you're living right in a country that's affected, you could see massive layoffs from all major corporations because credit will be frozen and corporations will be unable to operate as they're accustomed to. You could see new car sales drop to zero. You could see, imagine if interest rates spiked 3%, what the housing market or the commercial real estate market in the United States would look like. There would be no market. It would just absolutely collapse overnight. And in the midst of a real crisis like this, I can foresee interest rate swings as big as 2 or 3%. And for governments that are just absolutely strapped for cash, like the U.S. government, right now, just a 1 or 1.5% rise in interest rates would make servicing the national debt impossible. Let that sink in, folks. 1.5% rise in interest rates, Uncle Sam can no longer pay his debts.
When we're talking about all this, there's a lot of people who've been preparing for something like this for quite a while, where, they've been preparing with food, water, other supplies. They've also been preparing with gold and silver. But now we have cryptocurrencies, which is many of them are decentralized, and they're now gaining ground, and people are starting to wake up and, they're starting to look at them, and the central banks are starting to say, hey, wait a minute, what's going on here? What is your take on the cryptocurrency market and why this came about? And is this a threat to the central banking system, or will this be used as a currency moving forward?
There's always the potential for it to supplant central banking, but given the nature of government and the lust for power that exists, I don't think they're going to allow that to happen. I think that the nation states will clamp down on cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. They will in some way regulate them. They will require transparency of who owns what account, and they'll do that by law. They'll make the penalties severe, and anyone who goes up against that, they'll do it just like they do the tax system in this country, where they have show trials and they make examples of people and send them away for long prison sentences. So I do have some hope for Bitcoin and the other currencies. At least they have the intrinsic value just in the fact that they've limited the number of Bitcoins that can ever be created. The way they set it up was very clever in that the initial Bitcoins were mined electronically, and it didn't take too much computing power. You could actually do it with a home computer 15 years ago. Now it takes a supercomputer just to mine a very small fraction of a Bitcoin. And they built an algorithm in to make it increasingly hard to create new Bitcoins, to the point where in another 10 years, what's out there is it. There'll be just infinitesimal gains in the number of Bitcoins out there. So they've essentially set a currency unlike any paper currency any government created, because governments are only limited by their own avarice and the supply of paper and ink. At least with Bitcoin, the supply of Bitcoins is essentially fixed in the long term. So they have that going for them. The problem is that governments control their people. They control electronic communications, they control the internet, and they can basically decree whatever they'd like. Now, there might be some safe havens for Bitcoin offshore in some smaller countries, perhaps, South Pacific Islands or something like that. But for the majority of us, I would not pin my hopes on Bitcoin, because governments are very jealous of their power. They don't want to give it up. And if they see it melting away, they will take action and they will step in to regulate Bitcoin, and they'll make the penalties very harsh. So I'm a big believer in tangibles rather than Bitcoin, because at least with tangibles that you keep in your private possession, as long as you can keep them hidden, you can maintain some of your wealth in a place where it's outside the reaches of the grabby government. So, and in particular, I like silver. Small silver coins are probably the very best thing that people can invest in to hedge their risk. We could see a dollar crisis and a credit crisis coming. So hedge into small silver and don't entrust that with anyone else. Keep it in your home, very well hidden. Keep perhaps a smaller supply of it, not so well hidden. So if you're ever in a unenviable home invasion situation where you can just turn that over to the home invaders and hope for the best, and then have the rest of your silver well hid, even better hidden. But aside from that, I can't think of many other places that are as low risk and high reward in the long term, because silver right now is grossly undervalued in terms of its intrinsic value. And because most silver production is a byproduct of gold production, even whether it's a strong economy or a weak economy, silver will always have value.
Right now, we can see that the precious metal markets, they've been manipulated highly. I mean, and they're still being manipulated. I think the real manipulation is with the central banks. I don't even think it's with, HSBC or Deutsche Bank or any of the other banks. I think that's just the outliers. I think the real manipulation is happening with the central banks. And when that manipulation ends, I do believe that gold and silver, they're going to skyrocket. And when I look at cryptocurrency, it reminds me, because they're not really manipulating the cryptocurrency, and I see cryptocurrency like Bitcoin rising each and every day. Sometimes it falls, of course, but I feel that this is like a reflection of where gold should be going or silver should be going.
Right. Yeah. In fact, the same forces that move the Bitcoin market also shape the precious metals market. And if it weren't for the manipulation, we would see silver and gold much higher. But when governments make these pronouncements, like India just announced last week that they're going to slap a 3% tax on gold. Well, the Indian gold market is huge. I mean, the traditional market every summer for the wedding season there takes up a huge portion, like 30% of the world gold market every year. And for them to announce, we're going to levy a 3% tax on gold sales, it has a devastating effect. I think the reason that the powers that be are trying to move against gold and silver right now is because here we are in June, when precious metals traditionally year on year go into a summer doldrums period where very little happens with the gold and silver and platinum prices over the summer. And typically they kind of wobble down 5 to 7% each year over the summer, and then they bounce back in the fall. But this year, that hasn't happened. There were no summer doldrums, and I think that has the governments and the central banks panicking.
So you're seeing that the purchasing of precious metals is continually increasing. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, people are still buying precious metals. A lot of the trade is very quiet, and a lot of the hedging that's being done right now by the national governments has been very quiet. There have been some very well publicized gold sales, like England very foolishly dumped about 60% of their gold right when gold was at its lowest point a few years back. Somebody deserves a medal for that. But the governments are falling into two camps right now. You've got the governments that are on the decline, that are selling off their precious metals out of desperation, and you've got the governments that are ascendant, that are buying gold as quickly as they can whenever the price is right. And that's countries like Russia right now, for example, that's acquiring a pretty large stockpile of gold. And you can look at that two different ways. You can look at that monetarily, or you can look at that militarily, because gold is also and silver are both metals that are crucial for war production.
You mentioned war. Do you still see us heading into any type of war? I mean, I know we have the crisis with North Korea, the Middle East, and now it looks like the Middle Eastern countries are all ganging up on Qatar. So far, we're seeing a whole mess of things happen right now.
Yes. In fact, war is always the last resort for national governments that are in crisis. And we've had a hidden crisis since the year 2000. And we have so many prospects for war right now. I'm sure the governments would be thrilled to see us get into a global war, a World War III, in effect, because that might be, in their eyes, a salvation from economic collapse. And if you want to back up a little bit, you can look at war kind of like a company that does repossession of cars. If you stop making payments on your car, you get your car towed away by a repo company. It's no longer yours. Well, if a government is bankrupt, a war is essentially like kingdom towing. You could be no longer in the government business if you lose a war.
From your analysis and when you look out into the world, what do you see where we might see something get kicked off, or there might be a spark of where things start to head south? Because right now there's not been that much, especially in the corporate media. Yes, they played up the North Korea angle. The Middle East, they're not really mentioning that much. Where do you see things happening?
I still look at Syria as the primary flashpoint, in part because there are so many countries and non-state actors, banks, and surrogate forces involved. Syria is just an absolute quagmire. The Syrian government itself is essentially a puppet government. The Russians are very heavily involved. You have terrorist groups from all over the planet converging on Syria, each forming their own little faction, some of which are pro-Assad, some are anti. It's just this bizarre Twilight Zone situation. And because it is essentially foreigners getting involved in a civil war, this is almost akin to the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s. And you can look at World War II really as an extension of the Spanish Civil War because it involved the whole world. But before World War II, a lot of those same people, same countries, were all putting surrogate forces into the Spanish Civil War. Like, we had the Lincoln Brigade of mainly communists from here in the United States that went to Spain to fight. There were German surrogates. There were Italian surrogates. So the Spanish Civil War really could be seen as a precursor of what we'll likely see coming out of Syria. It could very well blow up into a regional war and then a global war very quickly. It could spin out of control, and it could start with something as simple as one Russian plane being shot down by an American missile system.
Now, just a couple of days ago, we had the U.S. shoot down an ICBM out in California over the Pacific. And this was in preparation for North Korea, I guess, firing an ICBM at the United States. In your mind and from your expertise, is this actually really possible to do? I mean, when they actually performed this, they had the missile type, the trajectory, they knew exactly where it was going to fly. Would the United States be able to stop these ICBM missiles coming into the States?
Conceivably, yes. The problem is we don't have a fully integrated system like Ronald Reagan wanted when he conceived of this, what he called the Star Wars program. We, by treaty with the then Soviet Union, were only allowed 2 full-up anti-ICBM, what they call ABM systems. And since then, we really have not really created a real network of ABM defenses. And the threat from North Korea is fairly discreet, but even with that limited threat, what we have right now is essentially prototypes, and we don't have a really integrated anti-ballistic missile shield for this country.
So what do you think the purpose was for them to do this test? Why did they make a production out of it?
Because I think they wanted to make a political point. They wanted to basically taunt North Korea and try to push Kim Jong-un back down. It's like they wanted to strap him into his high chair, basically, I guess would be the good analogy. We really don't have a integrated ABM system, so threatening to be able to use it is kind of an empty threat, and it's a very dangerous threat.
Do we still have to worry about getting prepared?
Absolutely. I think it's crucial that the head of every household in America first get right with God, pray about preparedness, and then substantively work on preparedness for their families, because governments have proven themselves absolutely incapable of mitigating disasters. It comes down to individual families, and as the heads of families, it's our responsibility to provide for and to protect our loved ones. Our children are counting on it, And for us to fail to do that out of complacency is doing our children and grandchildren a huge disservice. We need to continue to prepare. We need to stock up, team up, and train up like we've never done before, because the threats are even larger than before. People, when the Cold War ended, people got complacent. And now with the inauguration of Mr. Trump and seeing what the Trump administration is doing, people are making the same mistake. They're feeling complacent when the threats are still manifold and where we still need to keep our family preparedness at a high level. We need to have 2 or 3 years of food storage. We need to have water filtration. And we need to, if possible, have a retreat location for as many families as possible, because it may come down to using them. Because when the big machine stops and things fall apart, it's going to get very, very ugly in the big cities and in the suburbs. And the only places with relative safety are going to be in lightly populated, food-producing areas, whether they're farming regions or ranching regions. That's where your safety will be. And that's where I've encouraged my readers with Survival Blog to relocate for many, many years.
James, thank you very much for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. Once again, how can people see your work?
Again, it's survivalblog.com. It's been posted daily with daily updates for the last 12 years. All of the content there is fully searchable. There's no super secret members only area. It's all freely available, fully searchable. There are thousands and thousands of articles, letters, column items that people should take full advantage of. Part of the preparation that I was talking about for families is digging into those articles, printing out the most important ones, putting them in hard copy binders, and then copying the rest electronically to a couple of 8-gigabyte memory sticks would be very wise. Again, it's all free of charge. I'm not here to sell anything. Take full advantage of it, folks. Again, it's survivalblog.com.
James, once again, thank you very much for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, and God bless you and all your listeners.
You too. Thank you.